You're watching a Highwire Media podcast.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Connect the Conspiracy. This one, a Vatican conspiracy. So the big question is, was Pope John Paul the first Pope poisoned? Is he the recent one, or is he John Paul II? I think John Paul II, right? He was John Paul II was most recent. John Paul I was earlier. If someone asked me who the Pope is now, or I should say previous Pope, I'd be a little hard pressed to name him. I mean, I know this Pope because he's American and Chicago freaked out when he got elected. But, I mean, honestly, I don't keep up with popes. I'm not a Catholic. But I guess we're going to find out if one of these dudes was poisoned and burned the black and then the smoke and stuff, right? Albino Luciani was found dead in his bed in the early hours of September the 29th, 1978, after yet another night of restless sleep following a hard day at work. The official cause of death was established to be myocardial infarction, better known as a heart attack. In normal circumstances, that sentence should have been followed by a hard full stop. But in the case of Mr. Luciani, I'm afraid we'll have to replace that full stop with a hefty dose of howevers, followed by a good serving of allegedly. Why do popes have different names? The dude's name is Albino Luciani, and he's like, yeah, just call me John. However, he had already started to leave his distinctive mark on the Holy See, hinting at institutional reforms which were bound to leave many a power prelate deeply unhappy. Moreover, no autopsy was performed after his death, and Vatican authorities had bungled official communications about his demise, releasing statements which proved to be complete and unjustified lies. If that wasn't enough, revelations about the Pope's long list of enemies started swirling in the dimly lit corridors of the Vatican Palace, spilling unchecked onto the pages of newspapers and allegedly non-fiction books. Crooked financial institutions, the Mafia, secret Masonic lodges, among others, all appeared to have a strong motive to get rid of that smiling, caring, unassuming, yet tenacious Pope. So the questions lingered on for decades about the ultimate fate of Pope John Paul I, also known as Pope Luciani or the Smiling Pope. He's smiling because he got with the Mafia. Mafia's being like, yo, Popey, what can we hook you up with? You just gotta like, why would the Mafia want to work with a Pope? What advantages does the Pope have that the Mafia could use? Had he died of natural causes, or had he been poisoned? Was there a murderous conspiracy slithering inside the Vatican fueled by shady financial interests and organized crime? In his 30 days as pontiff, the Smiling Pope had left a profound and positive impression on many Catholics worldwide who perceived his warmly intelligent demeanor as a promise for a more open and similar approach to the Christian faith. And when we get into the dealings of those who surround Albino Luciani, you may understand why one may entertain that notion of potential poisoning. Before we analyze the death of the Pope, it's only fair that we address his life. Albino Luciani was born in northern Italy on October the 17th, 1912, the son of a devout Catholic mother and a socialist anti-clerical father. He grew up to admire both the church and Christ's commitment to helping the poor. In 1935, Albino was ordained as a priest and slowly but surely started to rise through the ranks of the clergy. In December of 1958, he was appointed bishop by Pope John XXIII, and in December 1969, Pope John Paul VI appointed him patriarch or archbishop of Venice. This was quite the appointment. As patriarch of Venice, Luciani oversaw the spiritual needs of the inhabitants of a vast region in northeastern Italy, as well as the day-to-day administrative duties of the clergy reporting to him. Luciani soon consolidated his reputation as a man of simple, humble tastes, and yet the perennial smile which lighted his features concealed a steely determination. The patriarch was a workhorse, a steamroller who toiled away at his duties up to 15 hours a day, answering every letter and listening to everybody who wanted to speak to him. This episode is sponsored by NordVPN, the fastest, most reliable way to stay safe online. Let's be honest, the internet isn't exactly a safe neighborhood anymore. Between hackers, data leaks, and companies tracking everything you do online, protecting yourself is no longer an option. That's why I use NordVPN. NordVPN keeps your data encrypted and your identity private with next-generation security. So whether you're on public Wi-Fi, traveling, or working from home, your information stays yours. Think of it as your own digital security guard, always on duty. And with over 6,000 servers in 60 plus countries, you can connect anywhere in the world with a single click. Want to stream shows from another country or access websites that are blocked in your region? Easy. NordVPN makes it happen instantly. I use it personally when I'm researching true crime cases and need to access archived or international sources. Keeps my work secure and my connection private. So here's the deal. Use the link in the description today, and at checkout, get a huge discount on a 2-year plan plus 3 extra months free. That's 77% off a 2-year plan with 3 extra free months. It's an incredible offer for complete digital protection. Don't wait until your data ends up in the wrong hands. Stay safe, stay private, and stay secure with NordVPN, because your digital life deserves protection. Now, let's get back to our episode. Failure was a rare occurrence for this smiling bishop, but he did fail, and it was on those occasions that he first clashed his will and his wits with a trio of characters, which will take center stage when we get to the conspiracy theories. Whenever these 3 gentlemen are mentioned by English-speaking reporters, the adjective shady is consistently used. They were shady businessmen who performed shady financial deals. Accordingly, I'll keep them partially in the shadow for now. Allow me to introduce them quickly. I shall provide some more details later on. The first character was a fellow archbishop, American Paul I'm going to butcher his name, Marcinus, head of the Institute of Religious Works, known by the Italian acronym IOR. The Institute, often referred to as the Vatican Bank, this is a misnomer as it gives the impression that the IOR is the National Bank of the Vatican. The IOR is just a Vatican bank, mostly concerned with financial investments. And oh god, I hate these names. Marcinus was closely associated with one Roberto Calvi, Director General of another bank, Banco Ambrosiano, and those two were close friends with yet another banker and investor, Michele Sindona, himself allegedly involved in money laundering on behalf of the Mafia. But back to Luciano now. One of the institutions he could rely on in his duties was the Catholic Bank of Venice, a small bank which loaned money on very favorable terms to parishes and dioceses. At the time, the IOR owned 37% of the shares in the Catholic Bank, a relative majority. In 1972, Paul decided to sell the stock to Calvi's Banco Ambrosiano, an operation that was facilitated through Michele Sindona's intermediation. Paul's Vatican Bank pocketed $45 million in the sale, a much-needed injection of cash for the institution. The Catholic Bank of Venice was now controlled by a private institution, which had little interest in financing the charitable works of local churches at advantageous conditions. Obviously, Patriarch Luciani could not tolerate such callous application of unbridled capitalism. Had he known about it, he would have certainly opposed the sale. But that was the problem. Despite him being the most senior clergyman in the Venice region, Paul had acted behind Luciani's back. In the late 1972, Luciani had another banking-related disappointment. This time was the collapse of the Bank of San Marco in Venice itself, another small financial institution inspired by Catholic ideals. Also in this case, Albino Luciani may have had a grudge against Paul. The IOR could have saved the San Marco from bankruptcy, but they didn't lift a finger. So in February 1973, Luciani visited Rome to meet with Pope Paul VI and with Giulio Andreotti, a senior Christian Democrat politician. During both encounters, Luciani complained about the unscrupulous conduct of Paul and his Vatican bank, advocating for a restructuring of such an institution. I'm going to stick with calling him Paul because his last name is just complicated for me. Why had Paul associated himself with businessmen already rumored to be money launderers for organized crime? Why had he so prominently sacrificed the good old Catholic Bank of Venice? Why had he not reinvested the cash to save the Bank of San Marco? Luciani's short stay in Rome made an impression on Father Arturo Elnati, who later stated that Luciani had a personal meeting also with Paul. The two archbishops clashed in the latter's office, but the American clergyman refused to yield to Luciani's continued demands to save the San Marco. Of course, I'm saying his name wrong. Luciani's short stay in Rome made an impression. Oh, wait. Excuse me. Luciani confided to a friend that Paul had unceremoniously shown him the door. He said, quote, "I have been treated by Paul like a school janitor. It seems as though a rivalry had been born that day." And Father Malnati may have been influenced by rumors circulating after the death of Paul oh my god, I hate butchering his name. After the death of Pope Luciani. While I would not discount 100% of Malnati's account, let's at least consider other differing versions. First of all, while there are official records of Luciani other important Roman meetings in February 1973, there are no written records about his encounter with Paul. The American Archbishop himself admitted to refusing to save the Bank of San Marco despite having the power and opportunity to do so. In an interview released to journalist John Cornwell, Paul declared that he did not know the San Marco was so important to the church in Venice, but in any case, he would never have acquired it because it was a bad investment. He realized that such a move may have angered the Patriarch of Venice, Albino Luciani, but the two had neither met nor otherwise discussed the matter. Let us now skip to the next big event in Albino Luciani's life. Following the death of Pope Paul VI, Luciani, who had become a cardinal in March 1973, was invited to join the conclave, the assembly in charge of electing the next pope. It took the conclave only 2 days to agree that the new pontiff should be Cardinal Luciani, and on August 26, 1978, he became Pope John Paul I. 2 days after his election, he clearly signaled that a new Catholic Church under his direction should not concern itself with material concerns nor temporal power. John Paul I did so by canceling the traditional lavish and pompous coronation ceremony, which was replaced by a simple inaugural mass. If the message was not clear enough, the new pope spelled it out in a speech to foreign diplomats. The Catholic Church, the Holy See, the Vatican would not concern themselves with political and economic matters, but simply with a spiritual agenda, and I quote, "humane causes that the temporal power is intended to advance." At another point in his speech, he announced, quote, "We have no public goods to exchange." Some days later, on September 10th, he delivered another landmark speech, this time in front of a packed St. Peter's Square. The Italian elite was shocked to hear the Pope uttering some almost blasphemous concepts. God is our Father, even more, He is our Mother. What was this gender-bending heresy? How dare this plucky newcomer upset so radically the word of the Lord? Guess what, guys? He's the Pope, and he chose him. Whoops. If you don't like it, whose fault is that exactly? It turns out that the Pope, Luciani, had been quoting directly from the Gospel of the Lord, more precisely from the Old Testament, even more precisely from the prophet Isaiah. Paradoxically, the same establishment who had elected Luciani as Pope appeared to be constantly on edge about what he might say or do in his first days on the job, and yet his criticism of the Vatican's business interests and unorthodox views on Catholic doctrine were well known. Just to give you an example, back in 1968, when he was still bishop, Luciani, our protagonist, had penned a confidential report addressed to his superior, arguing that the Church should allow Catholics to use the contraceptive pill. A radical departure from the Vatican's position on the matter. The spread of HIV/AIDS in Africa has been influenced by a variety of factors, not just one single cause. It's true that the Catholic Church had historically opposed the use of condoms, advocating for abstinence and fidelity instead. This stance, particularly in heavily Catholic regions, might have influenced attitudes towards condom use. However, attributing the AIDS pandemic in Africa solely to the Catholic Church stance on condoms oversimplifies the situation. There are other significant factors contributing to the spread of HIV. After his death, there was some speculation that he intended to make his own stance the official one. But the truth is that Pope Luciani never spoke in public about his positive views on birth control. The conservative faction, which was likely to oppose a new pope, was particularly strong amongst the Roman Curia, the administrative central body of the church, and the body itself was torn by internal rivalries and bickering, which absorbed much of John Paul's time and energy. The Pope was 66 years old by this time, still maintained his 15-hour-a-day regime, and probably the accounts where he kept his was heavily overdrawn when it came to handling this type. On the last day of his life, September the 28th, 1978, Pope John Paul conducted his daily grind. Hard at work, reading and writing tons of documents. Especially reading. He once joked that he did not need a typewriter, but a type reader so that he could process the reams of incoming letters and memos faster. Those who were close to him, like his personal secretaries, noted how John Paul appeared constantly overworked, overstressed, and fatigued by the sheer volume of workload in the weeks after the conclave. At 6:30 p.m., the Pope had held the last meeting of the day with Vatican Secretary of State, Cardinal Jean Villot. Yeah, I'm butchering this name. After the meeting, John Paul dined with his personal secretaries, Father Diego Lorenzi and Father John Maggi. During dinner, the Pope experienced pain and a sense of oppression on his chest for about 5 minutes, at one point, clutching the area with his hands. Father Maggi suggested they call the doctor on call of the Vatican, but John Paul refused any help. The pain was easing. Besides, he had experienced it on a number of occasions before, and he attributed it to mild rheumatic pain. After dinner, the Pope placed 2 phone calls, one at 9 p.m. with the Archbishop of Milan, and one at 9:30 with his personal doctor back in Venice. Pope Luciani then retired to his bedroom. Father Lorenzi, worried about the Pope's health, helped him to his bed. He then pointed to the emergency button next to the bedstead and advised him to push it should he need help. As the personal secretary left the room, John Paul was sitting upright on his bed, holding some typewritten pages, the last memos of the day. The next morning, September the 29th, at 7:30, Italian public radio news agency ANSA broadcast the most unexpected news. Only 33 days after his election, Albino Luciani, Pope John Paul I, had been found dead in the morning in his bedroom. The newswire mentioned the official cause and time of death, acute myocardial infarction, which happened at 11 p.m. It also included a description of how his body had been found. Quote, "This morning around 5:50, the Pope's secretary did not see the Holy Father praying in his chapel, as was his custom. The secretary entered his bedroom and found him dead in an upright reading position. The ensuing news reports identified the secretary who found the Pope's lifeless body as either Father Lorenzi or Father Maggi. The truth is that neither secretary found him. For some reason, the Vatican press decided to hide from ANSA that John Paul had been found first by 2 nuns. Sister Vincenza Taffarel had been assisting Pope Luciani since he was the Bishop of Venice. Every morning at 5:15 a.m., the sister prepared a cup of espresso and left it on a table just outside the papal bedroom. She would then return shortly afterwards to collect the empty cup. That morning, the nun noticed that the cup was still full. The sister addressed another nun working with her, Sister Margarita Marine. Quote, "He hasn't walked out yet. How come?" So, Sister Margarita witnessed Sister Vincenza knocking on the door of the papal bedroom. When no response came, she walked in. The sister heard the other nun saying, "Your Holiness, you shouldn't be playing these pranks on me." She then called for Margarita. The second nun entered the room and noticed how the Pope appeared to be sleeping, with a faint smile on his face, and still clutching his memos. Sister Margarita touched his hands and felt they were cold. The fingernails had started to darken. The two sisters went to fetch the Pope's personal secretaries. Father Maggie was the first to appear on the scene. He then alerted Secretary of State Cardinal Velat, who in turn summoned the doctor on duty, Renato Buzanetti. As the secretaries, the cardinal and the doctor filed into the bedroom, the two sisters walked out. Some minutes later, Maggie joined them and informed them of the doctor's diagnosis. The Pope had succumbed to myocardial infarction at 11 p.m. The death was sudden, and John Paul had likely suffered no pain. One of the sisters later reported that Father Maggie had asked the two nuns not to mention it. It was them who had first discovered the body of the pontiff. The reasons for this decision are not clear. It has been speculated that Vatican officials simply found it inconvenient that the Pope had been found by two women. Whatever the motive, this clumsy handling of the event generated initial confusion on the circumstances of Luciani's death, fueling suspicion and conspiracy theories. In the early hours of September the 29th, Vatican officials took another more controversial decision, which was also poorly handled and communicated. They decided that the body should not be subject to an autopsy and arranged for the Vatican funeral directors to immediately embalm the deceased Pope. Immediately after Pope Luciani's death, rumors began to swirl around the corridors of the Vatican and in newsrooms across Italy. Fueled by the poor handling of the early news and the decision not to perform a post-mortem on the body. It did not help that, according to some early bungled statements, the Vatican funeral directors of choice had been summoned 1 hour before the body was discovered. So for the moment, let's put ourselves in the shoes of an ordinary Joe trying to make sense of the news in Rome in the late 70s. The entire country was, and partially still is, steeped in a mindset which Italians refer to as dietrologia, the conviction that someone somewhere is always conspiring behind the scenes. I think we kind of have that in America, I think, honestly. And there are some good reasons to look for dark conspiratorial cabals lurking around every corner. Let me just give you a couple of examples. In 1964, General De Lorenzo of the military police had plotted a coup d'etat known as the Piano Solo. The coup was eventually halted in its inception and revealed only years later. It emerged that General De Lorenzo enjoyed the support of high-ranking politicians, as one Archbishop Odie. In December 1970, a second coup was attempted, this time by a former fascist naval officer, Valerio Borghese. Armed insurgents were ready to take over public institutions when the coup was silently aborted. Again, the plan only came to light in March of 1971. And in later years, a broad conspiracy fresco was unveiled. Borghese had found allies among far-right terrorists, members of the Secret Service, and even support from the U.S. Embassy in Rome, as attested by CIA declassified files. Investigative journalists had already started writing about the alleged unholy alliances between the mafia, terrorism, secret Masonic lodges, certain political parties, and deviated members of the armed forces and secret services. So suspect number one, the French cardinal. The least conspiracist in this case, however, is not an Italian author, but a British one. David Yallop, who laid out his theories in his 1984 bestseller, In God's Name, Yallop speculated that Albino Luciani, Pope John Paul I, had been murdered with a lethal overdose of a cardiology drug, digitalis, also known as digoxin. The author confidently claims that a fatal dose of digoxin, half a teaspoonful, would be undetectable if it was added to the other medicines which the Pope took regularly. A treatment called Effertil indicated for low blood pressure. Yallop did not single out one single culprit, but several suspects, all of which had something to gain from the Pope's death. These alleged poisoners may have acted independently or may have conspired together to eliminate their powerful enemy from the Vatican. So let's start with Cardinal Jean Villot, the Secretary of State. The Cardinal may have had the occasion to administer the lethal dose of digoxin, as he had met with the Pope on the afternoon of his death at 6:30 p.m. According to several testimonies, he was one of the first to the Pope's bedside on the following morning. He may have had the occasion to remove any incriminating evidence. And what about the motive? The Cardinal had been in the post since the previous pontiff. I always hate trying to say these words. Under the previous pontificate under Pope Paul VI, the recently elected Pope Luciani had inherited the Cardinal from his predecessor and disliked his policies. Sensing his dismissal, the Cardinal had therefore decided to eliminate his new boss. Which, I mean, now that I think about it, as we continue this, it seems a bit extreme. Like, I don't like his policies very much. It's like, doesn't seem like a reason to murder your boss, especially when you're like super religious and your boss is literally the Pope. The claim was debunked by Paul Hoffman at the New York Times as early as the book was published. It appears that Pope John Paul I actually valued the overall performance and advice of the Cardinal, and one of his first acts as pontiff had been to confirm his appointment as Secretary of State. There is a second possible motive. According to several Italian journalists, such as Eric Frattini and Federico Basserni, some days before his death, Pope Luciani received a copy of Political Observer, a magazine edited and directed by investigative journalist Mino Picorielli. He had an uncanny ability to recruit confidential sources within the secret services, which allowed him to expose political and criminal scandals ahead of his peers. In the mid-70s, he had either willingly joined or infiltrated a secret Masonic lodge, Propaganda Do, or P2 for short, which in the early 80s would be exposed as a massive conspiracy aimed at installing an authoritarian regime in Italy. This experience made him something of an expert on secret Masonic lodges. In the September 1978 issue of Political Observer, featured an expose about a secret lodge replete with senior clergymen. This was quite the scandal, as the Catholic Church did not see eye to eye with Freemasons, striking them with excommunication. Excommunication is exclusion from participation in the sacraments and religious services. In other words, one could not be a member of the clergy and a Freemason at the same time. So the magazine published a list which included several high-ranking players within the Curia, including the Secretary of State. So the speculation here is that the Pope may have been enraged by the expose and may have considered purging the Vatican of the Masonic Lodge, but he was stopped before he could take action. Now, there are several problems with this theory, in itself rather flimsy. In his original article, Pecorelli himself seemed to take the list with a pinch of salt, not citing the source and warning that it may be a fabrication. So even he thinks it's not real. Furthermore, there is no direct evidence that Pope Luciani actually received the issue of Political Observer with the list, nor that he decided to act upon it. In fact, there are differing views on how the Pope got a hold of the document listing the Vatican Masons. According to Pecorelli's sister, it was the journalist himself who handed the list into the hands of the Pope the very day of his death. This is unlikely, as we know exactly how Luciani spent his last hours of life, and there are no records of Pecorelli visiting the Vatican, so I would exclude the Masonic conspiracy from the realm of possibility and proceed to the next big hitter in Yallop's roster of culprits, a character we already introduced. None other than the American Archbishop Paul, head of the IOR, aka the Vatican Bank. According to Yallop, Luciani was concerned about the IOR's shady financial deals, championed by the pragmatic and morally ambiguous Paul. That's right, I'm going to stick with calling him Paul because all these last names do not work for me. The American archbishop had in fact conducted business with questionable partners such as bankers Roberto Calvi and Michel Sindona. Now let me give you some details about these financial deals. Please note that this matter is incredibly complicated, so I'm only going to scratch the surface of these details. In the late 1950s through the 60s, the Vatican Bank was booming. According to author Eric Fertini, in those years, the IOR controlled about 5% of the Italian stock market, thanks to a law promulgated by Mussolini in 1942 and never abrogated. The Vatican was exempt from paying taxes on capital gains. But in 1968, the law was changed, and suddenly the Vatican faced a tax bill of about an estimated $1.3 billion. Back then, the Pope was Paul VI, who decided to move all the Vatican's investments abroad to dodge that bill. The man in charge of this complex operation was Michel Sindona. In the late 50s, the financier had forged personal and professional relationships with three very powerful individuals: Paul, Mafia boss Joe Adonis, and David Kennedy. Kennedy, with no relation to the Kennedys, future Secretary of the Treasury for the Nixon administration. In 1971, Paul was appointed head of the IOR, and his cooperation with Sindona intensified. Thus, the Bank of Bishops enjoyed the protection of organized crime, the Nixon administration, and the church. Was able to freely move capital across tax havens and shell companies, laundering money on behalf of the Mafia and the Vatican. In the same year, Sindona found another ally, fellow banker Roberto Calvi, the director of Banco and Bragiano. The trio, Marcinkus, Sindona, Calvi, were on a money-making, tax-evading roll until 1974. Nixon's resignation removed a powerful ally from the scene, Secretary David Kennedy. At the same time, both Italian and American authorities had begun investigating Sindona for his involvement in money laundering as well as drug trafficking. Thus far, the partnership between Sindona and Paul had been encouraged by the Vatican's Office of the Secretary of State, but when he became an embarrassment, they were quick to dump him and appoint Roberto Calvi as their sole financial advisor. This didn't sit well with Sindona, who shopped his old pal to the financial authorities. Italy's central bank ordered an inspection into Banco Bragiano, uncovering a can of worms of enormous debt, fraud, tax evasion, and corruption. Uh-oh. This constituted another huge embarrassment for the Vatican Bank and its head, Paul. Luckily, the Bank of Bishops could still count on the protection of Paul VI. But on August 6, 1978, the pontiff died and was replaced by John Paul I. In Yallop's reconstruction of events, Paul and some mafia-friendly associates feared that the new pope might enact an overhaul of the Vatican Bank, an overhaul which would have kicked off with the dismissal of Paul. The plotters may have been joined by another American prelate, Cardinal John Patrick Cody. Finally, Cardinal's name I can actually pronounce. Later under investigation for financial misconduct in the Archdiocese of Chicago. However, in his book, Yallop was unable to produce little more than rumors and conjecture when it came to this alleged conspiracy perpetrated by the IOR. This theory rests on two pillars: that Luciani and Paul bore a grudging rivalry against each other since the events of 1973, and two, that Luciani had already announced either an investigation or dramatic shakeup of the IOR. As we have learned earlier, the rivalry between the two may have been exaggerated, if not entirely made up. And while Pope John Paul I realistically disapproved of the IOR's banking practices, there is no certainty that he already laid out plans to dismantle it, nor that he had publicly announced them. There is another fallacy, not strictly related to the Paul theory, which pertains to the method of the alleged murder. Yallop speculated that Luciani had been poisoned with a lethal overdose of digitalis or digoxin, which he claimed amounted to half a teaspoon. Now, if I can have my own 2 cents here, I did some research on the effects of overdose of this drug. According to the journal Australian Prescriber, the drug can, in fact, cause fatal cardiac arrhythmia if administered in large doses. Death can sometimes occur asymptomatically, but is more commonly associated with other adverse effects such as anorexia, nausea, vomiting, neurological symptoms. On the night of his death, Luciani did not display any of these side effects. Moreover, according to Heart.org and Medscape, a single dose of digoxin has to exceed 10 milligrams in order to be fatal. The most common formulation of the digoxin oral solution has a concentration of 0.05 milligrams/milliliters. In other words, to achieve an amount of 10 milligrams, one should administer a dose of 200 milliliters of digoxin solution. That's like one of those mini cans of Coke they give you on an airplane. For context, 200 milliliters is equivalent to 40 teaspoons or 4,000 drops. The Pope is going to notice if he's being poisoned with this. Therefore, this is not some lethally potent and concentrated venom which some devious bishop could carry concealed in his ring like some pantomime villain. It'd be pretty difficult to mix a surreptitiously fatal concentration of digoxin into someone's drink or medicine. A similarly fatal concentration could be achieved gradually over a long period of time, but it would almost inevitably carry the side effects that I described earlier, which again did not afflict the Pope in his last days of life. Paul appears to be the chief culprit, also in another much more recent book, When the Bullet Hits the Bone, published in October 2019. These are the memoirs of Anthony Luciani Raimondi, a former Italo-American enforcer with the Colombo Mafia syndicate. Also, Anthony is related to the legendary Mafia Don Lucky Luciano. More importantly for our case, his cousin happened to be Archbishop Paul, who, by the way, died in February 2006. The enforcer revealed that when he was 28 years old, the cousin summoned him to Rome to help eliminate the Pope. According to his account, Pope John Paul I had uncovered a massive financial fraud within the Vatican, masterminded by the bishop banker. The fraudsters had been counterfeiting shares of large American companies such as IBM, Coca-Cola, and others to then sell at a huge profit. I guess this was possible back in the day when shares were actually printed as individual pieces of paper and kept safe inside security boxes. Pope Luciani had collected evidence on the scam and was about to report the counterfeits, so naturally, he had to go. Raimondi's job was to travel to Rome and then shadow the pontiff to study his movements and habits. On the night between September the 28th and 29th, Raimondi had infiltrated the Vatican palaces and was standing outside the papal bedroom. The murder, however, had been perpetrated by Paul himself. The archbishop had spiked the Pope's tea with Valium to knock him out. Later, he crept into his room and administered a lethal dose of cyanide with a dropper. On the morning after, when the dead body of Luciani was found, Paul rushed into the bedroom, acting surprised and dismayed. I feel like if somebody gets murdered, you should look at the person that rushes in the fastest and then kind of gives you that look of being surprised and dismayed, because they're the ones that probably did it. Raimondi's memoir was rejected by the Vatican as complete and utter rubbish. One may argue that they are not an impartial actor in this case, but I tend to agree with their one-star review. The first question that springs to mind is, why would he seek help from a younger, fitter, more violent cousin with ties to the mafia, and then commit the murder himself? Logically, it would have made more sense to delegate the act to the mafia enforcer for the sake of plausible deniability. Raimondi states that his job was to shadow Luciani, take notes of his habits, but in those 33 days as Pope, he barely left the Vatican palaces, and he adhered to a strict routine very well known to all those around him. If that was the extent of Raimondi's involvement, Paul could have spared himself the airfare from New York to Rome. Finally, Raimondi states that Paul was one of the first to rush to John Paul's bedside once his motionless body had been discovered. This contradicts several verified and published accounts which claim the contrary. The first to rush into the bedchamber were 1. The two nuns who assisted the Pope, 2. One of his personal secretaries, and then next was the Secretary of State, and finally, the doctor on duty. My humble opinion is that Mr. Raimondi has included this nice tale in his memoirs to drum up some press coverage. Well, appears he succeeded, as we're covering it right here. Again, in my opinion, the former mafia hitman cleverly painted himself as a secondary and rather inconsequential character in the scenario of Luciani's murder, casting blame instead on the long-dead Paul. Well played, Raimondi. Please don't try and whack me. So far, we have covered publications which espouse the murder theory. So let's now look at two books which support the official cause of death originally communicated by the Vatican. The first one is Like a Thief in the Night by John Cornwell, published in 1989. Cornwell conducted an inquiry similar to the one pursued by Yallop, but he reached a completely different conclusion. According to Cornwell, Pope Luciani died of natural causes, but his death could have been prevented if the Vatican administration had given him more support during the first weeks of his pontificate. Instead, the new pope was left to his own devices, stressed and overworked. Cornwell argued that John Paul's already fragile cardiovascular health deteriorated progressively, culminating in a heart attack. The second book, Pope Luciani, Chronicle of a Death, was published in 2017 and written by the journalist Stefania Falasca, which is part of the commission in charge of John Paul's beatification, a key stage in the process to eventual sainthood. They acknowledge that the Vatican took perhaps too hasty of a decision to embalm. Ah, yes, they embalmed him. That was it. No autopsy, and then they embalmed him. Luciani's body was embalmed without performing an autopsy, a decision which fueled conspiracy theories. She explains, however, that the same procedures had been applied to the previous pope, Paul VI, to prevent the decomposition of the body in the heat of the Roman summer. As for the autopsy, or lack thereof, the book debunks the myth that it was the cardinals who decided not to perform it. This decision was actually taken by the Vatican doctor and two other cardiologists. They were quite certain about the cause of death and believed it was not necessary. She then went on to include the integral medical record compiled by the Vatican doctor, who certified the death as caused by cardiovascular disease, ischemic heart disease due to coronary atherosclerosis. Buzzanetti's records also clarify how this type of ailment ran in the late Pope's family, and Luciani himself, back in 1975, had been hospitalized due to a thromboembolism of the central artery of the left eye's retina. This cause of hospitalization was compatible with Luciani's atherosclerosis, which would later have a much more severe effect. And to me, that seals the deal, and one would be excused for holding this notion. The conspiracy theories revolving around the Pope's death gravitate around the IOR, Calvi, Sedona, banking scandals, or the secret Masonic lodges, with frequent overlaps. And all the major characters involved have been assassinated, allegedly. Do you remember Roberto Calvi, the director of Banco Ambrosiano? He was found dead hanging from the Blackfriars Bridge in London on June 17, 1982. His death was initially ruled as a suicide, but in 2005, the case was reopened as a murder trial. The roster of suspects included several members of the Sicilian Mafia, as well as a character worthy of his own episode, one Luciel Gelli, head of the subversive P2 Masonic Lodge. All were acquitted, but the Italian magistrate acknowledged that Calvi's death was not a suicide. And then there is Michele Sindona, the other banker. On July 11th, 1979, a lawyer investigating Sindona's deals, was gunned down by the mafia. On March 18th, 1986, Sindona was convicted for instigating this murder. 10 days later, he died from cyanide poisoning while in prison. And that's pretty suspicious. As per Mino Pecorelli, the investigative journalist we have already discussed, is unsolved shooting. However, all these deaths were unequivocally violent. The identity of the culprits may still be a mystery, but the fact that these people were killed is not up for discussion. In the case of the Smiling Pope, his death was apparently and mercifully peaceful. There may have been some initial ambiguity on whether the causes were natural or not, but the proponents of the poisoning have never been able to materialize convincing evidence. Despite my initial propensity to err on the conspiracy side, I can confidentially say that Pope Albino Luciani died of natural causes, As sad and unfair as it sounds, a man who had shown great promise to modernize a stale institution died 33 days into his mandate. He definitely had a sharp brain, a vast intellect, and a big heart. Unfortunately, that same heart proved too weak to cope with the pressures of his job. And that is our episode for this week's this month, I should say, Connected Conspiracy. Let me know your thoughts on this case or on this conspiracy. Do you think he was poisoned, or was it just, health reasons for his death? And of course, if you want to support the channel, you can buy us a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/CTC podcast. Don't forget to leave a comment, hit that like button if you liked our videos. And you can listen to us on all major podcast platforms, Good Pods, Amazon Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts from. And with that, thank you so much for watching and listening. We'll see you next time. Thank you so much for watching this month's Connected Conspiracy. If you want to see more content, check out the video right here. Or if you want to see our current playlist, you can watch it over here. As always, thank you so much for watching, listening. We'll catch you next time.